Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Very much welcome to this workshop panel this morning at the SID conference. My name is Martin Witte. I'm a sustainable energy finance advisor with Tetra Tech based in Arlington, Virginia in the United States. I'm also a member of the Independent Technical Advisory Panel of the Green Climate Fund, which is another reason why I'm moderating this panel on climate adaptation finance this morning. Recent reports, including by the IPCCC, now estimate that emerging markets require up to $1.5 trillion annually until 2030 to adapt and transition to a sustainable, true net zero emissions and more resilient world. USAID, together with many other multilateral development banks and other government partners around the world, have set quite ambitious targets for mobilizing billions in climate finance from both public and private sources to address these needs. Climate finance and funding has historically been very much focused on the mitigation space, but in recent years, we've seen a lot more significant interest in also developing pipelines for adaptation projects and in mobilizing the required capital to implement them, to support communities and nations around the world to better withstand and to thrive in the face of the impacts of climate change. This includes financing needs across all sectors of development, from agriculture and food security to clean and sustainable energy sources. Implementing partners like Tetra Tech have an important role to play alongside leading organizations and governments at the local level to ensure climate finance is not only mobilized, but is also executed in a sustainable and impactful way. Alongside our clients and major donors, we work to support companies and governments to develop a pipeline of viable and investment-ready projects and to help create the necessary enabling environment for climate investment, including policy and regulatory changes, financial reforms, alongside our government partners and other stakeholders. We also must recognize the important role of on-the-ground experience, technical capacity, and convening power to de-risk climate investments. I'm very glad to discuss these issues today with you and that we have an esteemed panel of very, very experienced people, experts and implementers on the ground on how we can address adaptation needs for the mobilization of climate finance and what's needed for sustained impact. I will now introduce the speakers and then we go in a couple of rounds with questions. Unfortunately, in this format, we don't have the ability to take questions, but I hope we can cover the most interesting points, and whoever is interested after this session can happily approach us with more questions and feedback, and we're happy to discuss anything further after this. The first speaker I'd like to introduce is Carolina Barreto, our own Energy Access Director with Tetra Tech. Good morning. Carolina has an engineering background, has more than a decade of super hands-on experience in energy access and climate finance issues in developing countries in Latin America, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa. So very much welcome to you. Then we have Phera Ramoeli, the Executive Director of the Permanent Okavango River Basin Water Commission, who originally hails from Lesotho, has a science background, and has more than 20 years of experience in transboundary water resources management, including with a long stint at the SADC Secretariat, where I had the pleasure of working with Phera for quite a few years. And then finally, another great team member from our Tetra Tech world is Darlington Tuagben. Darlington is the lead for the landscape and low emission development strategies with the USAID West Africa Biodiversity and Low Emissions Development Projects. Darlington originally hails from Ghana, where he is now as well, and he's another scientist with a lot of very relevant on-the-ground hands-on experience in climate finance and specifically adaptation project implementation. So very much welcome to the three of you. I think we start out the session with a first question sort of relating back to what I said in my introductory remarks. In recent years, as we all know, the international community has stepped up efforts to provide financing for climate adaptation efforts. There's been numerous new initiatives, numerous new adaptation funds that have been created. But really, we don't really see a lot of action just quite yet in terms of large and growing pipelines. And my first question to all of you is, what really are the key barriers to tapping into these capital pools? Are there any specific methodologies to ready projects for investments? Where do these investments really come from? And perhaps I can ask Carolina to start us out.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm thinking about this and it seems that same situation with other type of business sectors. Adaptation is particularly much more difficult. And just say this, right? In nature, we can go.
Karina, you're very hard to understand. Perhaps while you fix your audio, if I may, I'm just going to switch over to Perry. Perhaps you can start us out, and then if you fix your audio, you can come back. Hopefully that works. Phera. You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I was mute. Look, I think, let me first of all introduce a bit of a background of where I'm from, which is Southern Africa, managing a river basin shared by Angola, Botswana, and Namibia, a relatively pristine river basin that is still quite good in terms of biodiversity and other important global goods and services that it provides. Now, it is of great interest for us in this basin, and we have done a lot of work in trying to see how we can have sustainable financing to support our activities. And of course, with that in mind, some of these adaptation funds, like the Green Climate Financing and others, are very attractive to us in terms of being able to access and fund our programs through them. In a sense, we have also embarked on establishing a fund ourselves in the basin to fund largely environmental conservation and adaptation in the basin, the so-called the COP Fund. It's basically a hybrid fund with a sinking and endowment fund that looks at supporting a number of activities within the basin, particularly targeting communities who are based in the basin, largely very high levels of poverty in these communities with a number of threats and issues that affect their lives. Now, one of the things that one has identified as limitations or barriers to accessing some of these funds has been capacity on the basis of those who apply and need to get these funds to develop requisite proposals that would be amenable to attracting the financing. This is also because what I've seen, the kind of requirements and eligibility criteria that is there for some of these funds is not always a straightforward and easy thing to come by. So you have to really have a lot of capacity to be able to do this. Of course, another challenge is what we always have as lack of finance-ready projects that can actually feed within the requirements of some of these funds that are available. Hence why, on our part, we wanted to develop a dedicated fund that can support dedicated activities that are peculiar and unique to our system in Southern Africa in the Tuagben-USAID-WABILED River Basin. There are also issues of transboundary considerations because managing a river basin shared by 3 states is not the same as running some of these programs from a point of view of a country where some of the requirements, for instance, in terms of the eligibility criteria that you have to look at, like enabling environment and such things, can be determined easily if you are one country. But if it's a transboundary issue, it does become a bit of a challenge because harmonizing the approaches of the 3 countries in terms of creating the enabling environment for financing in this kind of context might actually be a challenge. So all in all, we think that this kind of challenges do bear, and we need to generate and create capacity within our member states to develop projects that can easily be attractive and be able to attract financing from some of this available financing. But most importantly, a comprehensive climate resilient program has to be developed that can then attract some of this financing that would have a transboundary implications, even if activities are implemented in each one country, but with the benefits that can transcend boundaries and benefit the whole system. I thought this would be my first start at the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Phera. If I may, just a quick follow-up. We always hear that organizations have trouble accessing these global climate funds. When you talk to them who manage these funds, they will tell you, well, we don't see the pipeline of projects that we could actually finance. So, basically saying that there is no real lack of money, it's the lack of quality pipeline. What are the two, just quickly, the 2-3 key issues that you think need to be done in order to get a higher quality pipeline to these into these funds?
Well, thank you very much. At the transboundary level, which is where I'm working from, first of all, the countries should be willing to jointly implement some of this project, infrastructure or otherwise, even if the activity happens in one country, but there's got to be agreements in place to allow the countries to agree that the benefits out of such a project would benefit the rest of the basin states. For instance, currently we are having a potential project in the upper basin in Angola and make it available to supply the various needs of the 3 states, including production of hydropower. It would require that the other 2 countries are agreeable that they can see benefits that will accrue to them, even if the dam is physically in Angola. And there has to be instruments, for instance, interconnectivity in terms of power transfer between the source and the needs where the power will be required. So some of these critical aspects are really important, and a joint program which is agreed between the states is always very important, so that they would have already done scenario assessment of what if, and if we do it here and if we do it there, what would be the highest impact that we can realize in implementing some of these activities.
Thank you. Thank you, Phera. So specific issues in regional projects that require cross-border cooperation. Darlington, yes. Perhaps over to you in Ghana. What really are the key stumbling blocks to getting the billions out of these big funds into projects? What are the key barriers from your perspective?
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've already introduced WABILED, and like my colleague, WABILED also operates a transboundary management program within the Upper Guinean Forest. At the landscape level, we work between 4 countries: Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire. The goal of WABILED is to promote biodiversity conservation and climate resilient, low emissions development in West Africa. And so in recognition of the biodiversity investment, WABILED last year launched a project to assess the potential of private sector investments and engagement in the 4 countries that are named through a 3-step approach. The first was the market assessment, which aimed to understand the market dynamics and identify opportunities within those countries. The second was the private sector engagement, which aimed at developing a private sector engagement strategy, and then the investment facility and feasibility study, which aimed at assessing the potentials of creating an investment opportunity to deploy tailored financial products and technical assistance services to emerging SMEs and social enterprises. So WABILED as a program takes key those emerging opportunities that exist in the climate change sector, and then think that we should work with private sector to build the capacity. With this background, I spoke about the market assessment, which was the first approach. And the market assessment that we conducted in the 4 countries identified 7 key barriers that were common to all 4 countries that we thought limit their ability to attract more climate financing. The first being the lack of awareness and information. That is, most of those countries, they indicated that they were not aware of some of them were not aware of the available financing and funds for climate adaptation. So in our recommendation, we thought we need to increase awareness and then provide information about eligibility criteria and application processes. The second barrier we identified during the market assessment was insufficient capacity and expertise within those countries. We observed limited technical expertise and capacity that hinder access to climate financing. So we thought also that there's a need for capacity building programs and then partnerships to help overcome this barrier. Another key barrier we identify is the stringent and complex application procedure by the donors. As most, I think my colleague just spoke about it, complex procedures and stringent requirements by funders really discourage potential project developers. Most of these countries, firstly, we will always say the political will need to be there, but we observe low capacity to even develop the proposal and implement the project. So this has been a barrier that we thought we needed to flag. Then the financial and risk challenges. There are limited concessional finance and high cost of capital that pose challenges to accessing climate financing. So we thought innovative financial instruments and risk sharing mechanisms would therefore attract investment and mitigate associated risks. Again, across these countries, we saw that the regulatory and policy framework were also barriers to accessing climate financing. There were inconsistency or inadequate policies and regulatory frameworks that deter investors. And then we also, some of those projects that they developed, were they bankable? Were they realistic? So most of those projects, we intend that projects must demonstrate viability and measurable impact. So therefore, a comprehensive project planning, stakeholder engagement, and pre-investment support will therefore be needed to improve readiness for these countries. The last but not the least, as identified during the market assessment, was the coordination and collaboration. We realized that there was a lack of coordination among stakeholders, which hampered fund mobilization. So we actually thought that there were therefore the need to strengthen partnerships that would streamline processes and leverage resources effectively. So these were the barriers that we observed as a result from the market assessment within those four countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Darlington. Just a quick follow-up. That was very interesting. If you were to weight these 7 barriers, which one would be the most important? Or if you can't assign a weight, where would you start? I mean, these are pretty significant barriers. Is the best starting point building capacity of institutions to apply to the adaptation fund or to the climate investment fund of the World Bank? Or where would you start, just briefly?
Again, my focus on the landscape that I've worked, because I interacted with those individuals or institutions. The first major challenge they indicated was the complexity in the application procedure, a lot of requirements. So the question would be, how can the donors, the funders, relax some of the requirements, especially for countries that are within the Upper Guinean or forest ecosystem, or in the Amazon basin or the Congo basin with the remaining forest, and then they are impacting positively climate change. Another one would be the political will within the government, and then low capacity. Most of these institutions will tell you, oh yes, we lack funding. We want to do this, but do they have the expertise? Do they have the capacity? So these were key. I think if you ask me, those are the first 2 priorities that I would recommend that we work on. Then the awareness and information. Yes, they sometimes get the information about the financing, but if their capacity is not up to the task to develop concept notes, proposals, and other requirements to satisfy the funding requirements, they cannot go in for those.
Thank you, Darlington. Carolina, what is your view?
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Better, yeah.
So no, I think so. I was mentioning as the nexus. statement of like complexities of cross-border, right? Adaptation is much more difficult, I think, than mitigation.
Sorry, Karina, we still can't understand you. It's completely mungled up, unfortunately. Perhaps you could rejoin and then see whether we can make this work. And in the meantime, in order to be efficient on time, we'll just move on to the next question. And Darlington, you already spoke about the market scan that you did in the region, including with private investors. You know, understanding what are the barriers for them to develop and then raise funding for climate infrastructure investments, for example. What is your view? What role can the private sector realistically play, specifically in adaptation finance, where a lot of projects that we see lack a clear sort of revenue base that private sector would typically look for in order to make projects commercially viable for themselves? And what can possibly development partners like USAID and others do to strengthen partnership with the private sector to help develop these kinds of sustainable models to mobilize also private sector finance for adaptation?
Thank you very much, Martin. Let me start with the last part. What can USAID and other partners do? So let me reference again this market scan that we conducted. Based on the market scan of the limited financing towards the 4 countries that we mentioned, and the various barriers that I just outlined, WABILED decided to then explore further the role of private sector in achieving our conservation and climate initiative or climate goals. And we did this. We did this through two key axes. The first was through the development of a private sector engagement strategy, which are intended to support the private sector in increasing their actions towards the promotion of biodiversity conservation and climate resilient or low emission development in the region. And the second axis we also consider was the assessment of the potential of creating an investment facility to deploy tailored financial products and technical assistance services to emerging small and medium scale enterprises and then social enterprises in conservation in the 4 countries. And I will keep emphasizing those 4 countries because those are the countries within the Mano River. Those are the 4 Mano River countries where we conducted this assessment. So as a result of this scan of these 2 axes, the following key lessons were learned from the first axis, which I mentioned, the development of a private sector engagement strategy. We realized that 4 key private sector engagement modalities were identified based on the review of USAID private sector engagement policy, but we also thought using lessons from other private sector engagement strategies. So the first modality was advocacy. And advocacy involved raising awareness among our partner firms on the benefit of highlighting conservation and climate change related features in their marketing and branding materials. The second modality was convening, which involved identifying the key actors and potential opportunities for public-private partnerships or PPPs. The third was the technical assistance and information sharing, which include support for co-creation of corporate social responsibilities governance standards, provision of technical assistance and capacity building to businesses, and creation of awareness on corporate social responsibility initiatives within communities and small businesses. The 4th modality was the finance and investment promotion, which include conducting market assessment of upstream and downstream players to understand the value chains and financing structures operating locally. creating inventories of the small and medium scale enterprises within the landscape, and then supporting companies to develop concept notes and proposals required to access or to satisfy the financing requirements. So given the goal of mobilizing financing, WABILED have focused on 6 key types of actors whose operations potentially impact biodiversity, environment, and climate change efforts within the 4 countries. And those 4 actors, those actors include the agro-businesses. And the agro-businesses, we are talking about the local agricultural firms and the global supply chain. We intend to work with them to create awareness on climate change and biodiversity conservation activities. Then we come to the next actors, the processing firms or the processing group. What we intend to do is to work with them to preserve biodiversity through sustainable sourcing of their raw materials. Then we have the forestry firms, who we are going to work with to increase forest cover and then support carbon sequestration efforts. We thought the landscape we work, we thought the mining firms were so key, and we thought to work with them to reduce GHG emissions and then promote biodiversity conservation within the mining footprint areas. We have a group of actors we categorize as the association, and we intend to work with them to foster alignments between the relevant partners, and then those at the landscape, we categorize them as collaboration via landscape. And the intent, those include the community stakeholders who are the custodian of the forest and the land. We intend to work with them to create awareness on biodiversity and mobilize actions. So yes, this is the effort, or these are the efforts WABILED or USAID to WABILED have been doing in those landscapes with the private sector to ensure we get the buy-in and towards our climate change initiative and biodiversity conservation.
Thank you, Darlington. Super interesting. I think this effort of trying to create sort of sustainable business models from the ground up in sort of the adaptation arena to help companies grow, new revenue streams. That's very promising. We see a lot of movement also on ecosystem-based approaches there. So that's very exciting. So Carolina, you're back. Perhaps we take one step back to the first question with regards to barriers and how we can leverage more finance into adaptation. But perhaps you can also speak a little bit about what it takes to really develop an investment-ready adaptation project. How do we get there? And then we swing around back to Phera to get his view on all of this as well.
Thank you, Jan. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Excellent success. Thanks to mobile technology. To be honest, I believe these two questions actually merge quite nicely, right? What are the barriers? What are the methodologies? And what an investment ready project is? I think they all connect, and I'll piggyback into a lot of the things that have been mentioning. But as Tetra Tech's Energy Access Director, I deal a lot with the nexus, right? So Phera was talking about the complexities of adaptation, with cross-boundary issues. I would add another layer of complexity with multi-sector, right? In mitigation, we can go back to our comfort zone, right? You can truly stay in one sector with mitigation. Coming from the energy space, right? We're doing renewable energy power plants. The maximum nexus we're gonna do with another sector is gonna be the environmental license permit, right? In adaptation, you're bringing finance to help people, right, in a more personal way, right, to help them mitigate with the effects personally of climate change, right? People losing income, right, and their livelihoods, their homes, etc. So it's much more complex, right? For example, in Senegal, right? Senegal has had the worst drop of GDP, they've ever seen, due to flooding, actually. And you need, right, to understand what are a lot of these issues. Drought is also another, big problem. Tetra Tech is implementing a couple of projects, water and energy for food, for example, that has to do with a lot of this nexus, right? And how energy, for example, can come and help these communities adapt, right, to drought, right? And when we finally think, bingo, we have the solution, solar drip irrigation can help with drought, I get the private sector telling me, Carolina, my farmer couldn't pay because their land got flooded, right? So I'm here thinking, finally we're helping them adapt with a technology, and then climate change obviously throws another curveball at us, so, what Darlington is mentioning about, helping these companies, private sector, come up with business models, right? Also helping them adapt to these type of events. Their business model has to be, resilience itself, right? So that those cash flows, right? And this is where resilience comes, right? We're talking about insurance. We're talking about, plugging in all of these methodologies, going back to your first questions, right? What makes an investment-ready project, right? You have a policy and regulatory framework in place, right? For example, storage in the energy space is a technology, battery storage is a technology very interesting that can help utilities adapt, and be more resilient. In California, for example, mini grids are being implemented, right, in order to be able to cope with a wildfire that is, becoming more and more, often, right? But then if there is not a regulation that is clear where the money, who's going to pay for, for these services, right? If there's no clarity on where the money is coming from, right, there's no finance, that is going to come in. So there's two aspects. Where is the money coming from, right? And once the project is being implemented, is the money really going where it's supposed to be going? And how do we account for that, right? Mm-hmm. So fortunately, technologies are being developed. The private sector, this is where it's exciting, right? The private sector comes in with all of this innovation, right? Digitalization is extremely important, and it's there, right? Mobile technologies are there, right? In Africa, we're all often talk about South-South, cooperation. I think a lot of the innovations from Africa, they need to be South-North, right? Mobile money, right, and the digitalization of African solutions, African-born solutions, right, are showing the world, right, the ability to connect with people, right, to connect where we are meaning all of this adaptation to actually happen, right? And then how do we tap into mobile money, right, to be able to bring that a climate insurance, right? How do we tap into all of those, African farmers that have a cell phone, technology to be able to receive money, right? So that they can also have access to those insurance, so that they can also have access to all of that data on how, right, all of these climate change events are going to affect their crops, their livelihoods, and their families. So I think a lot of this has to be connected. There's no secret sauce. None of this is new. Every project, Jan, that you're the finance expert, right, that is going to bring finance need to have figured out the mm-hmm. framework, right, policies and regulation, and the business model. Where is the money coming from, right? The cash flows. Yep. Then so, but on top of all of that, right, let's be accountable, right? Let's show our investors, right? The private sector needs to show the investors where the money is going, where is it flowing, right? And there's a lot of concern about greenwashing and on and on and on. The data is there, the technology is there. It's easier now than before to be able to prove, where the cashes are flowing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carolina. I think that point around new business models and how you actually create an environment that, value that you create can be monetized is a super relevant one. It's not just for battery storage, where, as a result of decentralization and diversification, you create value that most regulators are currently not providing, value against. But I also think this issue around accountability and showing impact is very important. And it's particularly difficult in the adaptation space, where I know for a fact from various climate funds, including the GCF, you are struggling more than in the mitigation space with showing sustained impact with clear methodologies, right? So in the mitigation space, you have multiple methodologies, either from the CDM or other sources, where you can show against generally accepted baselines, what you actually achieve with a certain project. And adaptation, showing, numbers of beneficiaries, showing sustainability over time is a lot harder, and a lot more methodological work will have to be done. Phera, I know you are working in a very difficult sort of space, transboundary water management, which, if I had to think about mobilizing private sector money, I wouldn't necessarily think about Southern African transboundary water issues. But I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts on this whole issue around, how we tap into private sector funding, how do we create sustainable business models? Because ultimately, the amount of public money is constrained and will remain constrained. And so if you want to achieve impact at scale, somehow you need to tap into that other pool of capital, even if it's harder. So if you have any thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Jan. I think, look, definitely it's relatively more difficult, not only because of transboundary, but essentially in terms of the water sector, the sector which we are operating within. It's quite difficult to attract private financing because economic rate of returns are not always guaranteed. And because of the social nature of the resource also, it makes that much more difficult. However, as in terms of what we think, at least from the perspective of a river basin that I'm managing, what is it that we can do as alternative sources of financing that normally would not only include public sector financing, but also private sector? We have developed a framework for ecosystem payment for ecosystem services that would require those who are earning benefits or who are dependent on the sustainable flows, for instance, in the Okavango, in the Delta. We have a lot of tourism operators who, by and large, are not contributing anything to the management of the system in terms of direct financing, but who, if we were to have a system that they could apply, for instance, levies for tourism, it normally goes to government coffers. It doesn't reflect in the basin management, which would then mean the people that are managing the system can ensure perpetual continuance and sustainable flows that are in the basin, including the environmental protection that the biodiversity in the basin depends on. So such kind of models of payment for ecosystem services is quite important and needs a lot of effort by governments to accept and be able to collect that revenue and distribute it accordingly to address particularly the lives of communities in these systems that inadvertently, if they don't have alternatives, they will end up degrading the very environment on which this thing is dependent. So it's quite a complex process, but I think with some of these innovative models, it can actually be realized. This particular payment for ecosystem services, for instance, looks at some of the tourism receipts that are received from these countries. They never find themselves back into the economics of sustaining the ecosystems that they are dependent on. And therefore, it becomes very difficult then to assure. For instance, during the time when there was a drought, the Delta, which depends by and large on the availability of water in the Delta, both in terms of water-based tourism, as well as sustaining the biodiversity, there was a lot of problems. People lost jobs, and there were serious challenges because those who are interested to come to the Delta would want to know that they'll be able to use the Mikoro and move around, see animals and all that, which because of lack of water then run away. But if we are having systems in place that make sure that, for instance, with care, storage that can assure supply of the resource downstream can actually be helpful as opposed to necessarily only being negative. So some of these things are quite important. And I think it takes a lot of effort to try and change the mindset of people who are involved so that some of these things, we are talking very, very, very loosely sometimes about benefit sharing. And, you know, you look at the 90% of that water coming from Angola and 90% of that water being used in the Delta in Botswana. How do we ensure that the benefits that accrue from those utilization plow back into Angola so that Angola can contain and still maintain the system functionality and give the communities that live in that environment alternatives, way of livelihoods that will make them to protect the environment and therefore assure us that in perpetuity you'll have a system that is functional. So some of these things are quite important to be promoted. Awareness creation is quite one of them. And of course, adaptation of some of these new approaches, such as the concept of sustainable development space. How far can we go to develop our systems without adversely affecting it, and agreeing as countries in a shared water course that this is something that we have to all agree to doing. So yeah, it's a complex, but I think with a lot of effort, it can actually be realized.
Okay, thank you, Phera. Perhaps another question, starting with Carolina. So when we look at project development for adaptation projects, there's always the important question: how do you make sure that you also reflect the needs and the leadership of vulnerable groups, of women, of youth, indigenous people? How do you make sure that those perspectives and inputs are being integrated into the project development and implementation sort of process? What is your view? What are sort of best practice approaches there that you see?
Thank you, Jan. I would say it has to start from the design, right, of every project. You cannot leave it as an afterthought. If it's not done from the beginning, it's just not going to happen. And unfortunately, this is what we see, quite often. It has to be integrated across the value chain of the project, right? So we could just go and ask a private sector company to develop their gender action plan, for example. But then if the institution itself, right, that from the government side of things is not, does not care for it, does not have a plan themselves, if the financial institution that is providing, the climate adaptation finance does not understand either, right? Then it's just not going to happen. And this is what, for example, some of the lessons that I can draw from the 2X initiative, right? That has to do with investment, in women and entrepreneurship in women. And what ends up happening is there's large commitments. I think it also resonates with the climate finance, right? Large commitments done, right? And then 1 or 2 years later, we go back to the conference where this initiative got launched, right? We go back to the COPs. And then what happens with the promises we made a year before, right? So don't get me wrong, these commitments are important. They need to be made. We just need to do the extra effort to trickle them down, right? Mm-hmm. So I would say, yes, integration into, gender integration across the whole value chain. And then from the finance perspective, right, incentives, right? So we do not want to distort the market. A lot of people tell me, Carolina, no, this distorts the market, right? But if the capital is not flowing, you need to incentivize it, right? And if it's not flowing to those most vulnerable, groups, right, that are not included, it's just not going to happen either. So, right, designing financial products that, some sort of a results-based finance, right? So that if the company, the private sector, the NGOs, the groups that are implementing the solutions meet those targets, then, you can extend terms, reduce interest rates, right? Those type of incentives.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina. And we're coming sort of towards the end. Perhaps, Darlington, if you have a couple of thoughts on this for 1 minute, go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry, I think I'm in line with Carolina. I think the major problem has been the issue of considering women, youth, vulnerable as integrated part of the project. And I think I suggest, I would recommend that they form a complete part of the design, and not just forming a part of the design, they should also be allotted budget lines. So you see that when we are implementing, as much as they are integrated among our objectives and other things, let them have a budget line because they are captured from the design. If they are captured from the design, they won't have that challenge to know where the budget will come from to ensure that they are integrated. That's the first issue that I think when really dealt with, we will have them embedded, we will have them seen, we will have them demonstrated in the implementation. There are also, besides the design, for the integration, we need to increase financing to directly address the people's vulnerability to climate change. We need to support low emissions development programs that create economic opportunities for women, youth, and other vulnerable populations in the landscape. We need to support the implementation of transformative, approaches that address vulnerable peoples. We need to support women's active leadership in producers or consumer groupings and in the value chains that make sure that aim at reducing the impact of climate change on them. They are always, in fact, among the gender cycle, women are most vulnerable. So we need to elevate their issues out there and make sure that we have dedicated resources to deal with the issue, including the youth and vulnerable population. So I will just stop right here, I think, because of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're coming to the end. Clearly we could only take a sneak peek today at the issues around sort of raising capital for adaptation finance. It's a complex subject. I'm taking 4 or 5 points away. There's this whole issue around complexity of accessing concessional pools of money from various sources that we need to work on, with capacity building, possibly working with these facilities to relax standards, if that's possible at all. I think this whole realm of developing sustainable business models with the private sector around adaptation is a key one if we want to really make the space sustainable. But at the same time, as Phera also indicated, there are limits to private sector engagement in the adaptation space. There will always be areas where there's no commercial business model, and that will also have to be taken into account and will have to be provided for. I think the fourth point that we spoke briefly about is, how do you actually show results? How do you show impact? And what are the methodologies behind it? And I think, especially if you want to attract private sector money, but also concessional money that will increasingly ask for evidence, what can you show for the money that we have given you, is absolutely key in my view. And then lastly, I think this whole notion of incorporating all stakeholder groups in project design, giving them a voice, is relevant, quite frankly, anywhere in the development space. But I think of particular relevance in the adaptation sphere, because as Carolina so aptly said, there are real people's lives at risk, people's lives being impacted. And you will only really be able to develop sustainable solutions, in my view, if you understand what happens on the ground and how people's businesses, lives, and other aspects are being impacted by adaptation. So I would like to thank all of you for contributing. It was a great panel. Thank you to all the listeners who we have not seen, but we are sure you are out there. Enjoy the rest of the day at the SID conference, and we might see you at the conference, in the food court, or anywhere else in Ghana, in Gaborone, perhaps in Botswana, where I would like to go. And have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.